Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Game Changer. I'm Maryam Zia. Today we will be discussing about the recent situation surrounding Pakistan-Afghanistan borders in regards to, of course, the Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan and problems they are creating for Pakistan. When we talk about the recent diplomatic efforts by Pakistan at United Nations Security Council, of course, we know that Pakistan's ambassador to UN, Munir Akram, has urgently called on United Nations Security Council to take decisive action against terrorism threats that is emanating from Afghanistan. Of course, we know that now Taliban representatives are going to be participating in these third round of Doha talks. We will be exploring all the expectations coming out of these, of course, upcoming talks in today's program. We will also be talking about Pakistan's renewed response to these threats that are emanating from, of course, Afghanistan. And in this regard, Pakistan's Central Epics Committee of the National Action Plan has approved a new military campaign, Operation Azm-e-Istehkam, that is aimed at eradicating threat not only domestically but from across the border. What kind of strategies Pakistan is going to be adopting, what it means domestically as well as internationally, we will be talking about in today's program. To discuss this and more, we are joined in the studios by Mr. Hamzah Riffat Hussain, who is IR expert. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We're also joined by defense analyst, Brigadier retired Waqar. Welcome to the program. Let me start with you. Of course, this is an ongoing situation. Of course, we know that in the recent past, there has been 83% increase in attacks only in the 5 months. What do you make of this situation, especially in regards to Pakistan's continuous push to Afghan interim government to, of course, to address these concerns? And what do you make of the actions that have been taken by the Afghan interim government so far?
Well, the 83% increase that you've actually alluded to, that clearly shows that the Taliban government has not done enough as far as eradicating sanctuaries along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border is concerned. I honestly think that if you take a look at this overall situation, the Taliban and the militant groups do share a similar ideology with regard to this extremist puritanical version of Islam that they actually want to impose not only in Afghanistan but also within Pakistan. So the sanctuaries are being promoted, they're being, you could say, abetted, they're also a nuisance to the Taliban government as well. But if you take a look at the situation overall, clearly the Taliban government, because it's cash-strapped, it doesn't have the writ of the entire Afghanistan, the entire territory of Afghanistan within its hold. It claims that it, has the writ of the entire government in its hold, but it does not necessarily have the ability to, clamp down on these sanctuaries to a large extent. These sanctuaries, Maryam, exist in very lawless areas within Afghanistan. They tend to, operate from funding from abroad as well. The problem here is that
we know about Indian fundings.
We know about Indian funding,
of course, in proxies that have been used, and Pakistan has been advocating regarding that as well.
Yeah.
But what are the main reasons behind the persistence of these sanctuaries? Of course, although Taliban government promised that they are going to be, of course, handling this issue, but TTP remains continuous threat for Pakistan.
It does remain a continuous threat from Pakistan, and I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we claim that the TTP and the TTA are not necessarily linked. The truth is that similar ideologies exist on both sides of the border. With regard to the Afghan Taliban, they've been very categorical that they are actually going to act against the Islamic State or Daesh within Afghanistan, the Islamic State in the Khorasan province, but they are very much mum with regard to how the TTP basically operates in Pakistan. This presents a security quagmire for Pakistan that the armed forces basically have to deal with. And you mentioned in your intro that they're looking forward to the prospect of actually attacking within Afghan territory. That means that they're willing to tap into the option of hot pursuit, which is beyond the borders as well.
We'll be exploring that later in the program.
The issue really is that the Taliban government, despite repeated assurances to the international community, has not been able to clamp down on sanctuaries within their territory. And these very same Taliban representatives who are going to be meeting in Doha, they've made it very categorical and clear to the international community that our territory will not be used against any other country after the US withdrawal. But clearly that's not the case, because this 83% increase clearly shows that the Taliban government has just not done enough.
And of course, this is alarming not only for Pakistan, but for the surrounding countries as well. We will be talking about other groups that are posing threats to the neighboring countries, and these threats are of course emanating from Afghanistan. But Brigadier Waqar, when we talk about enough action not being taken by Afghan interim government, what are in your opinion reasons behind that, that despite Pakistan's repeated call for actions, do you think that cash-strapped country and of course the lawlessness that Hamzah also alluded to are the only reasons? Can you elaborate on the reasons that so far this government has not taken enough action to protect the neighboring countries as they promised?
I think the Taliban II government came to power after the American exodus, and it was hoped that because Pakistan frankly supported them diplomatically and economically. The first investment conference for this government was held in Islamabad, because basically Pakistan has to deal with two things. One is, of course, the government sitting in Afghanistan and Kabul. The other is the people of Afghanistan. So that we have to differentiate, because on that side we have to be definitely adopting a softer approach. The hope was dashed by, I think, Taliban, because I think they deliberately used terrorism as a policy tool to draw concessions. And what were the concessions? One was the smuggling should be allowed. The TTP should be allowed to, come and settle in these areas. Maybe they wanted a reversion of FATA's status, which was definitely against the Pakistani state's interest, and of course, the government of Pakistan and the people of Pakistan. So I think prudent policy was adopted. And for the last 1.5 years, we've been tackling the terrorism, and twice, I think, we've struck across the border also. Taliban has to actually now realize that this is not going to work. Maybe they had this idea that Pakistan is a softer state, it's a pushover, and they can draw concessions through terrorism. So, government of Pakistan, political military leaders...
How does the Afghan interim government justify that they have not been able to, of course, address this issue? Because we know that they do have leverage over TTP, and of course, maybe they are part of the same ideology.
TTA and TTP are basically linked. It's a very, very clear sponsorship. The dossiers have been shared, intelligence has been shared. Pakistan is very, very clear. And if you look at Moscow format 2023, September in Kazan, all were present. The regional countries, Iran, Pakistan, Central Asia, Russia, China, and everybody told Mr. Muttaqi was sitting there this year to shut down the test factories, because it started affecting, they had skirmishes with Iran also. Neighbors are not happy. Then we had attack in Moscow. It's becoming an international, I would say, pariah state. And they have to realize, now you have talk of corridors, CPEC 2, then you have north-south corridors. They are going to actually bypass Afghanistan if they don't behave. So in case they want to get integrated, I think they have to change the approach. Terrorism not going to work. Pakistan has taken a hard stance. So we are very clear. We don't have to now be apologetic about it, that we have to request them. Basically, we have to deal with it.
Right. And dealing with it, Hamzah, let's talk about first starting from the diplomatic efforts that Pakistan has been taking. What do you make of those efforts, especially with the recent statements by Munir Akram Saab at United Nations Security Council, and of course with the upcoming Doha talks, and with of course the international community realizing now that they cannot keep Afghanistan isolated for long, because this is going to be posing threat not only for Pakistan but for across the globe. The terrorist attacks would keep on emanating from Afghanistan.
So I think it's quite clear that the diplomatic offensive from Pakistan, and I use the word offensive, is because the Taliban their policies have ensured that they stayed isolated on the international stage, and they've also become a pariah state. We talk about the status of women in Afghanistan, their inability for girls to actually go to school. I mean, these are things which are taken up very seriously by Western governments. And we talk about regional connectivity. I agree with what Brigadier Saab basically said. I mean, regional connectivity is only possible if the Afghan Taliban stop endorsing this puritanical ideology, which is haunting both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the wider region as well. Their inability to clamp down on sanctuaries is precisely why Afghanistan has become a pariah state in the first place. So we cannot necessarily say that, and Pakistan has been pointing this out. When Ambassador Munir Akram made that statement, he was making that statement based upon factual evidence that yes, the Taliban government has not necessarily been able to rein in these groups which pose a threat to the entire region. So if Afghanistan wants to stand on its own feet, I'm not talking about the people of Afghanistan, but I'm talking about the government of Afghanistan wants to stand on its own feet, they need course correction. They need to make sure the policies are more, investment centric. They need to make sure the policies are more people centric as well. And the policies need to have a trickle down effect on the local Afghan population. 90% of that country is basically suffering from, extreme poverty. And about 55 to 60% of the country is, susceptible to famine. So you have
and
a situation.
It's still one of the largest refugee population in the world.
Absolutely. And not only refugees in Pakistan, but there's been this massive exodus of refugees going to Europe and the United States as well. So clearly there's a problem with the Taliban government. You can argue that yes, they've been cash strapped and the billions of dollars which have been held by the US Reserve has not been given to them. But again, you see, it's all about the policies that the central government basically adopts.
Right, and coming back to the basic point of Taliban sanctuaries in Afghanistan, what kind of diplomatic efforts do you foresee Pakistan putting in near future, and especially in the light of upcoming Doha talks to actually persuade Afghan interim government to dismantle these sanctuaries in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, Pakistan can definitely use the investment card. When we basically go to diplomatic forums, we can clearly say that Chinese investment is coming in, American investment is coming in.
But Pakistan did sign a deal, an economic agreement back in March with Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
Well, again, you see the economic agreement, obviously cross-border trade has also been held hostage to terrorism. Let's be very honest. I mean, the Dorkham border has been opening and closing because of, Afghan actions and the Taliban's inability to rein in these groups. When we talk about the diplomatic response, it's very, very important to understand that when we talk about Pakistan pursuing this at the UN and at regional forums such as the Moscow format and everything, the key really is that Pakistan can convey to member countries all across the international community that, look, if you want investment within this region, the Taliban government needs to ensure course correction, without which you see CPEC, North-South corridors, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative. The dividends of these corridors cannot materialize unless and until the Taliban government does not get its act together. And now terrorism is a global problem. Pakistanis have suffered immensely, as so have the Afghan people as well. So clearly there's a pariah government in power in Kabul, which lacks the legitimacy. They can claim they have, the writ of the state, towards themselves throughout the territory. But there are certain territories which are beyond Taliban control as well. Or even if they are within Taliban control, they're unable to basically clamp down on those sanctuaries. And I think this is where Pakistan needs to really pinpoint that if this government needs legitimacy, you want investment in this region, you need to make sure that the government in Kabul adopts course correction. Otherwise, it's just not possible. So I think,
and talking about course correction, Hamzah, let's talk about Chinese leverage over Taliban. Do you think it has some leverage? And how can China push Afghan Taliban government, Afghan interim government to, of course, actually address this very much, of course, imminent threat that is, of course, not only impacting Pakistan, but of course the investment projects and CPEC is also being impacted because of these security concerns.
Well, I think China can definitely say, you see the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is very much active in Xinjiang. It's become a bit dormant over the years because of China's clampdown. But ETIM also has sanctuaries within Afghanistan. So China has a huge stake. Obviously, the Belt and Road Initiative is not only about CPEC within Pakistan, they also want to develop the western part of their country as well. So for that, a stable Afghanistan is extremely important. There have been back-channel talks between Chinese delegations and the Taliban as well. And whether or not, there's any leverage of that sort or not, I honestly think that China's leverage is extremely limited because of the very fact that the Taliban is seeking legitimacy from Western governments. And that's not being accorded to them. Yes, China can play a role, but you see the 83% increase in attacks, cross-border attacks, clearly shows that even Chinese diplomacy is not working. So it's quite clear that China can use the investment card and they can claim that, we want to invest in corridors, the Taliban should cooperate. I think, Maryam, one area where the Chinese are very different from the Americans is they don't care which regime is in power. Whether it's a military regime, whether it's, a clerical regime that's in Kabul, or it's a, regime which is democratic. They're willing to invest. But even for China, Afghanistan or the Taliban government has become a bit of a headache because of the spillover effects of terrorism. So back-channel talks have been taking place, but it's really not had a very significant impact.
Right. And Brigadier Saab, when we talk about the historical relationship between Pakistan and Taliban government, How do you see this situation unfolding, especially when we talk about Pakistan's continuous push and the relation between Pakistan and Afghan, of course, interim government evolving over time in future?
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental question, and at time we stereotype Afghanistan, Pakistan as two countries living in a bubble. It is not. A brief, on what happened to Afghanistan last 40 years. There were two occupations, not on our invitation. 8 years for the Russians and almost 20 years plus. So it meant that two superpowers were actually ruling Afghanistan. So, and there was, I think, 5 to 6 violent regime changes in that period. There were no elections, held per se, even Ashraf Ghani and Hamid Karzai's time. So it means that Pakistan was adjusting. And at times people forget, they talk of long-term policy. I feel there can't be any long-term policy because you have, the dynamics. It's a geographical shatter zone, as geographers call it. So it means you have to deal with Afghanistan almost on daily basis. So that should be the bottom line. So we had first exodus of refugees. Then we had, of course, Taliban won. Pakistan tried to, help them. And then you had second exodus when the Taliban 2 came. So now it's almost 5 million Afghan, which is larger than some of the European countries' population. And we are holding it for last 50 years, 40 years. It's a record. So it means that basically any government which comes, you have to deal with it. Now with Taliban 2, there were some hopes because definitely Pakistan helped them diplomatically, morally, and even economically because people of Afghanistan are involved. And we thought that after the American exodus, things would stabilize. But somehow, I feel that they adopted a total negative approach by resorting to terrorism. And it has been happening even in Ashraf Ghani's time or Ahmad Karzai's time. So somehow the Afghan government feels that they can pressurize Pakistan. They think it's a pushover. So I think that has been denied. Now I'll just talk of 5-pronged strategy, which is probably already in play. One is, of course, military operations will continue, intelligence with this side or that side. Then you have basically regional approach, as I talked of Moscow format. It involves regional countries also. It could be trilateral, Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan. And if Chinese interests are being hit by TTP in Pakistan, so it means basically it's a dual game being played by the Taliban. And I think Chinese now understand. A lot of information was shared with them, intelligence, even during this visit. They are also very clear. They've slowed down. I think opening of Waqar corridor, there were some development projects, but some area like Haji Cake mines or lithium mines, they're working. They would definitely try to help Afghanistan, but it can't be at cost of Chinese interests within Pakistan. So I think that is also becoming very, very important. Then you have the regional approach for, basically like Moscow format. Then Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan triangle, as I said, they had skirmishes. Iranians are also fed up. And then, of course, comes, your bilateral.
Right. So, Hamzah, of course, this 5-pronged approach is very important, and we will be exploring the recent approach launched by the military and civil government as well. But I want to ask about, of course, the upcoming Doha meeting and its significance, specifically in terms of a constructive dialogue on key issues that Afghanistan is facing today.
I think with regard to the upcoming Doha meeting, it's important to understand that many countries believe they have a lot of leverage with the Taliban, but that's not actually true. If you look at Pakistan in general, we like to claim that, the Taliban, the government is in power, we'll have a friendly relationship. As Brigadier Saab said, we will try to make sure that, diplomatically, we will also support them. But the case of the Taliban has become a bit of a rogue entity. Even, a country like Qatar, where Doha talks have actually been taking place previously, or the Quetta peace process, or the Quetta Shura, or you talk about the Muddy peace process, you've seen that the Afghan Taliban has behaved with this certain degree of hubris that, this ideology is here to stay. There will be no opposition in Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan have to capitulate to our ideology. And I expect some serious, you could say, discussions which will be taking place in this upcoming Doha meeting. But Maryam, we've seen such moods before. We've seen that there have been a lot of promise, but then the Taliban government's actions are to the contrary.
Right, but we know that in the last meeting, Taliban were invited, but they did not participate. In the first meeting, of course, they were not invited. And this time, in the third meeting at the end of the month, they have agreed to actually sit and talk. Of course, there are a lot of issues like you earlier alluded to as well, like women's rights and other issues, and human rights organizations are very much concerned about the issues that are going to be discussed. But still, do you think this is going to be a hopeful start? What should we expect from this?
Well, at least they'll be on the table, number one. And I think once they're on the table, there will be other countries as well which would try to make sure and pressurize the Taliban to actually, do away with some of their, draconian policies that they've actually adopted, not only for the Afghan people, but the spillover effect with which it is, impacting investment as well as populations within Iran, Pakistan, and also in Central Asia. I think the Taliban would be absolutely clear. They need to realize that without investment, Afghanistan cannot, progress the way it has. With 90% of its population in abject poverty, it's very important for the Taliban to actually show some flexibility. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from Pakistan and other countries that, for regional connectivity to take place and for investments to take place. Pakistan has been very clear that, the fact that we were also on the verge of bankruptcy and we're going through a very tough IMF program, we understand that, economic investments are the key towards ensuring prosperity in the country. But it really depends on the Taliban approach. You see, they're a very unpredictable entity. They need investments to govern Afghanistan, but they also need to, do away with their ideology as well. So far, I don't see these two schools of thought aligning with each other. And I think there will be plenty of disagreements in the upcoming Doha moot.
And what would be key issues that you see would be discussed?
I think, first of all, inclusivity. The Taliban is still a predominantly Pashtun entity. Ethnic Tajiks, Hazaras, as well as Uzbeks are completely left out. Many of them have actually fled to neighboring Central Asian countries, also here in Pakistan. Inclusivity. Number two, women's rights. Number three, doing away, the most important thing, and I think Pakistan will repeatedly talk about it, is the securitized discourse that sanctuaries need to be clamped down on.
And what about the frozen accounts and the economic conditions and the poverty that, of course, the Afghans, the common Afghan people are living in?
You see, that can only be unlocked. I mean, investment can only be unlocked, or the frozen accounts or the frozen assets that are due to be given to Afghanistan. Whether we like it or not, the Western governments have conditioned it on the Taliban's, domestic policies within Afghanistan. So if there's evidence, and there's definitely evidence that the Taliban is actually supporting nefarious rogue actors, then there's no prospect of these assets being unfrozen, or there's no prospect of aid actually being dispensed. So the Taliban government lacks legitimacy, number one. And for them to actually benefit from aid, they need to do away with their policies. That's not really going to happen. The other thing is, with regard to the status of women's rights, it's very sensitive in the West as well. I think that it's very clear that the Taliban need to make sure that there's universal access to education for women and girls as well. They have prevented girls from attending elementary school. That is a huge red flag for the Western governments as well. And Pakistan, given that, the status of women, it's not necessarily ideal, but it's still relatively better in Pakistan. It is a massive, point of concern as well. So clearly all of these policies, whether it's lack of investment, whether it's support for terrorism, whether it's lack of women's rights, it is going to haunt the Taliban to a large extent. And without addressing this, there is no prospect for legitimacy, aid, investments, and everything. And now that there's evidence of supporting terrorism, that would lead to further isolation of the Kabul regime.
Right, further isolation of Kabul regime, but of course Pakistan is now pushing for new campaign, and of course let's talk about, Brigadier Saab, the new military campaign that is recently announced, that is Operation Azm-e-Istehkam. How do you see this aligns with Pakistan's long-term security as well as economic goals, and can you elaborate on this campaign, how this is going to be different from the previous campaigns?
Yeah, I think Azm-e-Istehkam, as the name, pronounces, it's more of a resolve, and I think there are 5 basic contours. Of course, the intelligence-based operations are going to continue, as I think Prime Minister's office today in the morning tweeted that they're not going to be very large-scale military operations. So this is a continuation of what was happening in last 1.5 years. Then it's basically ownership, whether it's the provincial government of any province. So it's actually across the board. But mainly KP and Balochistan are affected, so the thrust will be there, but it's all across Pakistan. And the political leadership has to own it. And then, of course, it should be basically whole of the nation approach. Hardening of, your cyber borders also. Then you have capacity building for law enforcement, especially civil armed forces and police. And then judicial reforms, because there have been experiences that you get hold of these terrorists and then they get some relief from the courts. So it needs to be and then of course is the protection of Pakistan-China economic interest, like CPEC 2 is being launched. It can't be without assurances. But I think there are two more messages which have come out from the military. One is, of course, that till the time enough powers are given to military, because it appeared, in last 1.5 years that probably military was doing as an isolated effort, and there was no really moral or formal backup from political leadership of the people of Pakistan. The impression. So that has to go. So it means that should be owned by the people of Pakistan and government of Pakistan. So it's very, very clear. It can't be that the army is tied up, with their hands behind, and then you throw them in front of the test. And they said that we're not going to pick up the bodies of the Shuhada anymore if this is not ensured. It's very, very important. There are examples in Sri Lanka, one terrorist attack, then they, I think, gave entire leverage. Even within India, a lot of leverage given to military when there are insurgency hit areas. There are special laws. And then, of course, is that in case, it's like the hue and cry by political parties. In case they don't agree, the army actually is going to pull out from these areas and just be deployed on the borders, eastern and western border, and their cantonments for training. That's all. So let the politicians do whatever they want to do. So it's a very, very clear message to all the parties. And then they can put police and bureaucracy to fight that. So these two options are very, very clear. But I'm sure there's always there. And there's no
resolve is there of both military and civil leadership. So what are the potential outcomes should we be expecting after this recent resolve in neutralizing these threats that are emanating from Afghanistan?
Yeah, definitely. Afghanistan, as I mentioned, is a constant headache. And in terms of terrorism, but if you look at some indicators, the policy in last 1.5 years started working. Whether it is the Blue Subnexus group, some of major leaders have actually surrendered because of the military operation. And then the amount of pressure that has gone on Taliban, I think 2 or 3 senior TTP leaders have been killed in Afghanistan by most probably by the Afghan government. So it means that probably they would like to show it that they want to control. So there is some change. And I think this meet in Doha will also highlight some of the areas where basically different countries are going to take different stance, but terrorism going to be main thing on the agenda. I feel that policy is working, and in case Azm-e-Istehkam is given full push and support by the people of Pakistan and by the government of Pakistan and owned by the British, inshallah, it will have dividends very soon. Actually, 2024 has been declared to be the end of almost full control of terrorism. So it means that there is a resolve. Azm-e-Istehkam, you put operation with it, and people get like India. Even evacuation from Ukraine is considered an operation. This is just a reference point. But these 4 or 5, I think, important aspects, if fulfilled, it will help Pakistan economically and strengthen its internal security.
Right. And Hamzah, what do you make of Azm-e-Istehkam and this new resolve, and what kind of outcomes are we going to be expecting, especially in neutralizing these threats?
Well, first of all, Azm-e-Istehkam has come out of the military's increasing frustration with this increase in the spate of attacks, which have actually increased. Now, these terrorist attacks, affect cantonments, they affect military installations, and above all, it affects the people of Pakistan as well. So I think it's an excellent strategy, because clearly other efforts, whether it's diplomatic efforts, whether it's bilateral engagements, whether it's talking about the Taliban's, a draconian record within domestically in international and regional forums is concerned, clearly they have not worked. So Pakistan basically has no choice but to actually counter these terrorist groups, which the Taliban have either deliberately avoided or have actually abetted and financed and supported. So I think it's a clear enough strategy, but I think this particular operation needs political resolve for increased legitimacy. I think all parties on board. Pakistan is a deeply polarized country. We have political parties who are not even willing to sit together on different.
When it comes to the threat of terrorism,
absolutely,
of course,
and I think that's the
resolve of people of
the resolve of
Pakistan
people
with
of
the
Pakistan, as well as the
there.
resolve of the military, as well as the resolve of political parties. I think terrorism is one issue where, regardless of differences, whether you're from the left wing, whether you're from the right wing, everybody is willing to sit down and own this, because clearly other strategies against the Taliban have not worked. I mean,
so this is of course the resolve, but what kind of challenges are we going to be facing in actual implementation of this strategy, and also what needs to be done to address and foresee those challenges?
Well, first of all, I think the Taliban are definitely going to come up with an outcry that Pakistan is violating our sovereignty. I think the Taliban have repeatedly stated this, that if such cross-border attacks actually take place on Afghan territory, then the Taliban would also retaliate by doing the same within Pakistan.
Like Pakistan did in March.
Yes, like Pakistan did in March. So I think that's one challenge, but the problem is that outcry might not necessarily have a lot of traction because the Taliban itself lacks legitimacy and there's evidence
because
of them supporting terrorism.
Pakistan's patience has now
been
yes.
I think one challenge would be the nature of the threat because you see Afghanistan has rugged terrain and the border areas also has a lot of rugged terrain as well.
Let's talk about that. The geographical challenges, they also hinder.
Yes, because there are geographical constraints. I'm not trying to question the competency of our military, but the fact is that, you know, sometimes addressing these terrorist threats, the terrain is very difficult. I mean, the Americans were in Afghanistan for, you know, for decades, but they haven't been able to eradicate the threat of terrorism within
with the latest technology
with the latest technology and everything. So when you have rugged terrain, I think that's going to be a huge issue. And the other point is that you see, regardless of the fact that they've actually decreased in importance, the Afghan government also has its own intelligence agency. It's not known as the NDS anymore. It's known as, you know, the Taliban version of their intelligence agency. So that might actually result in counter IBOs taking place. Like, for example, if Pakistan goes ahead with an intelligence-based operation, the Afghan government with the Taliban would also make sure that they could have a counter IBO as well. There'll be lots of clashes and skirmishes as well. Once Pakistan pursues this would lead to a lot of cross-border skirmishes.
So are we not expecting any support from the Afghan interim government in regards to Pakistan's resolve to fight the threats that is emanating from Afghanistan?
The Taliban has been very clear that Pakistan is which is very ridiculous, but they actually claim that Pakistan is a state sponsor of terror. It has violated Afghan territory for a very long period of time. They've also claimed that Pakistan is a client state of China and the United States. So I think that to expect support from a rogue regime is idealistic thinking. There will not be any support for this. It's as simple as that.
Let's talk about the role of international community in all this and how international community is going to be viewing Pakistan's effort to protect its border, because these threats are not only to Pakistan, but they are going to be posing a threat globally.
I think the international community, I think there was going to be a very nuanced response to this. Western governments would actually quietly support Pakistan, but they would be pushing for dialogue with the Taliban government, which is pretty interesting because dialogue with the Taliban government from Western governments has resulted in a breakdown of talks. Dialogue has clearly not worked, whether it's within Pakistan, whether it's through the Doha process, whether it's through the Moscow format. The Taliban delegation does come over there, but then differences start to appear. So I think China would be very supportive of this. I think that there will be countries within the region who would claim that, yes, Pakistan is defending its own sovereignty and it's also looking to curb on terrorist hideouts within Afghanistan. But I think Western governments, which would be quite ironic because there is a double standard there, they would actually urge for greater dialogue between Pakistan and the Taliban government to diffuse tensions. But I think there would be, regionally, there would be broad-based support. It would be interesting to see what the reaction from New Delhi is to all of this, because there have been lots of back-channel talks between the Modi government and now he's, you know, it's Modi 3.0. So it's almost like, you know, the BJP and the Taliban have had talks previously. So it'd be interesting to see what India would react, how India would react to.
Right, of course, regional and of course neighboring countries' reaction we will be of course seeing in the coming days. But at the same time, Brigadier Sahab, let's talk about the steps that Pakistan has taken so far and is going to be taken after this renewed resolve to protect its borders. Can you elaborate a bit on that and how to address the challenges that are going to be appearing from this, of course, new strategy?
Yeah, I think I discussed about those 5 prongs, and mainly, you know, there are institutions like NACTA where everything can be synchronized. So mainly when you do capacity building, joint training, joint operations, and police in Balochistan and KP have been laid lives, they have been fighting on the front line. The only thing is, if you look at police capacity building in KP, I think there's a lot of gap that needs to be covered. Then there is intelligence sharing and coordination, because ultimately, like, you know, APS attack, the guys came, stayed for 2-3 nights in a mosque or somebody's house. So the entire nation has to get into it. So I'm sure they're going to be expanded. And then use of technology. Like we're talking of trans-frontier attacks into Afghanistan, maybe you don't have to put the boots on ground. So now we have high-tech. We've displayed it. Unfortunately, with the Iranians, there was a misunderstanding. And Pakistan did it precise type within very short time.
Right, and Brigadier Sahab, how significant is the role of international community in your opinion in all this?
I think now there is a realization, at least regionally, definitely the Western countries. Even if you look at who is taking what stance, very interesting. Like US, Japan, France, and UK probably are not attending. The only, I think, positive vibes are coming from Russia, China, and even Pakistan for engaging. Of course, Qatar is going to host, and then there are going to be some countries who will. India, I'm sure, definitely going to be there. But on the engagement, I think Pakistan is very clear. One is, of course, terrorism. Then is narcotics. And then comes, engagement with people of Afghanistan, because ultimately this initiative was taken by the UN Secretary General and his, special representative Rosa Otunbayeva last year. And that's because they felt basically it's the people of Afghanistan who are suffering. And UN has a responsibility. Within that, in case they can at least start breaking the ice with the Taliban, I think it could have some positive results. But as I think speakers mentioned, there's a hardened stance. But I think Taliban is also now realizing after 2 years, what have they given to people of Afghanistan? Even during flood, there was mismanagement. And in a few towns, there were the people standing against. Then there's the question of Northern Alliance, Tajiks and Uzbeks. So Taliban could have serious problems if they don't put their house in order.
Right, very important. Right, please
Yeah,
go ahead.
there's one more point. I think the Taliban can also, part of their outcry would be that Pakistan is deporting Afghan refugees from within the country. They can actually use that card by claiming that Pakistan is violating our sovereignty, and they're also deporting Afghans as well. But you see, the deportation, I'm not going to get into the vagaries of the deportation process, but what I'm trying to say is that there is some sort of, you could say, outcry that's going to come from Kabul once Operation Azm-e-Istiqam actually takes place. So the refugee card will be played.
Right. So thank you very much, Mr. Hamzah Riffat Hussain, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Brigadier Retired Waqar, for joining us in today's program. Of course, we discussed about Pakistan's calls for action regarding these Taliban sanctuaries and the threat of terrorism that is emanating from Afghanistan. Promoting peace and stability is a compulsion not only for the Afghan interim government but on the international community as well. That's all from Game Changer tonight. Take care. Allah Hafiz.